live.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's Regulatory Transparency Project webinar titled FAFSA and the Future of Higher Education. We're glad you're here. My name is Marie Blanchard and I am the Assistant Director of the Federalist Society's Regulatory Transparency Project. We're pleased to have with us a stellar panel of experts. Note, as always, the opinions expressed are those of the experts. In order to get right to the discussion, I'll hand it off to our moderator, Jim Blue, co-founder of the Defense of Freedom Institute. Please find more about our moderator and speakers today at fedsoc.org. That is fedsoc.org.
Thanks, Marie, and thank you to the Federal Society for doing this webinar. You all have been a great partner to DFI since we were launched in 2021. And I should note that coming up in a few weeks, we will have our Education Law and Policy Conference, which we co-host with Federalist Society. That's on September 11th. It'll be a very substantive conference. And in fact, for those of you who are interested, you can get CLE for it. You may not know DeFi or DFI, Defense of Freedom Institute. My co-founder, Bob Eitel, has been a long activated in Federalist Society. We were both part of Betsy DeVos's leadership team. Bob was senior counsel. I was then the assistant secretary for OPEPD. That's the office that handles the policy and budget for the department. If you'd like to learn more about DeFi, you can go to dfipolicy.org. We have a great panel today. I'm going to first introduce people. They'll expand on their bios later and their role currently. Diane Jones has had a long career in DC on the Hill at Institutes for Higher Education and at the department. She was acting as Undersecretary of Education under Betsy. Emmanuel, spelled with an AL at the end. Sorry, there's been some errors on that. He's also had a variety of federal policy roles. He is currently with the American Council on Education, or ACE. Steve Taylor, also a long background in higher ed, including a decade at ACE, and he is currently leading the Future of Work program at Stand Together Trust. I'm going to set out some road markers for the hour. Each of these segments will be about 10 to 15 minutes long. I'll start by doing a quick level setting. Emmanuel will lead off a section on the impact of this year's FAFSA on students and IHEs. Diane will lead off a segment about what might be done to fix FAFSA. Steve will lead a discussion on the impact of federal policy making. And then we've tried to leave some time for questions and answers at the end. You can submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. In case we don't get to all of the questions, if you'd like to include your information, I promise that we'll get a chance to respond to you later. Let me pause and ask Bram to load the slide. We've put together a few slides to help to level set very quickly. And I'll ask you to advance throughout this conversation, Bram. This is very high level and overly simplified. I'm sure the panelists will point out where my overview has missed or distorted key points. Just keep that in mind. This is meant to be a level setting because I understand many people on the call are very familiar with federal regulations, but not so much with FAFSA. So first, let's advance to the first slide, and we'll go through some basic facts. This will just take a minute. It's the free application for federal student aid. It wasn't always free, and it wasn't always unified through the federal government. The system simply does not work without it. And many state and private programs are also linked into the FAFSA. You simply cannot get access to any what's called Title IV of the HEA grants, and that includes Pell Grants, and direct student loans. My understanding is that those two items represent about 40% of the revenue for colleges and universities. FAFSA is particularly important for high school seniors who are going off to college for the first time. This year, we have been very far behind in that segment. That's about 2 million of the 18 million or so who fill out FAFSA every year. But that's picked up recently. Now they're 7 points behind what they were last year. And please go ahead and advance the slide. To save some time, I'm not going to go through this slide. But as they say, FAFSA simplification didn't just fall out of the coconut tree. It's been improving over time. Let's go ahead and advance to the next slide. You really can't talk about FAFSA simplification without talking about Senator Lamar Alexander. Once he became attuned to how FAFSA was actually an obstacle to students, particularly low-income students, getting access to college, he started his quest to move things along. Here's a picture of him unfurling dramatically the long form with 108 questions. Most of this in this field, I've seen this many times. And he was successful finally, after many years of effort, right before his retirement, to reduce the number of questions from about 108 to about 40. In order to do that, he had to change all these formulas that drive the whole aid process. Originally, they said the 23-24 award year for implementation. That would have meant October of 22. After a couple of months, they realized they better push that back a year, which they did. Let's move one more slide. I'm going to go through a rudimentary explanation of the process here. And I just got to tell you, I'm leaving a lot of stuff out, including what to do when there's a mistake or how you verify some of the data. But I wanted to give people a general high level of the process and familiarize you with some of the terms. Let's just advance the animation once. So first thing happens is you go up to the portal at the Department of Ed or the FSA, the Federal Student Aid Office. And you start to fill out this new shortened form. The thing that's new, one of the things that's new is that by doing that, you are allowing the system to access a lot of data at the IRS around your tax records. And that is then shared with the Department of Ed and by extension, the post-secondary institutions that are part of the program and others. That used to be an option, but under the new program, that's mandatory and it's required in order for the system to work. Go ahead and advance again. They take all that data and they put it through what's called the FM formula. There's actually several formulas depending on how many dependents you have or whether you're a dependent. Go ahead, one more. That is used to create what's now called a student aid index. That you may be familiar with the term expected family contribution, but that is largely the same. Go ahead. That is used to generate what are called ISERs or institutional student info records. Go ahead. The ISER involves both the tax data, the financial information, and other information. And it's then sent to the federal aid administrators via a system called EdConnect. That is a secure system. And then go ahead. And eventually the administrators create the aid packages and the offers for students. This is a simplified system, and you might ask, what could go wrong? Well, this year, virtually everything went wrong. Every point, every box on this chart is a point of failure in the system. And go ahead one more slide. I'm not going to go through this either. I was going to compare how things should go and where they went. Just suffice it to say, months of delay, errors at every step of the process. And we can bring off the slide now and ask Emmanuel to start the discussion about how all of this has impacted students and IHEs. And then we'll ask our other panelists to weigh in as well.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that overview, and thank you for the introduction. Once again, my name is Emmanuel Guillory. I do work at the American Council on Education. Before that, I was with the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities. Before that, I was with the United Negro College Fund. And before that, I worked in Congress myself for 10 years, most recently on the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. And so when it comes to the impact of the FAFSA on institutions of higher education and students, at ACE, we actually conducted a survey when we were aware that the FAFSA was going to be delayed from October 1st all the way until December 31st. And at that particular time, institutions had to actually update their SAGE mailboxes, so their student aid internet gateway mailboxes. And so that was happening, and that was a potential hurdle for institutions to be able to receive their ISERs, to be able to properly package the aid for the students when it came to enrollment. But within our summary, we had found that 67% of our respondents had mid to low confidence in their ability to basically process the ISERs in a timely manner. That was an issue that was happening at the time. Also, within our respondents, 79% of them believe that they would be able to generate the financial aid awards within 1 month of receiving the ISERs. So that gives you an idea of the time frame. And as it relates to considering the current events around the FAFSA and all the things that were happening with the delays, nearly half of our respondents, around 47%, actually reported that they would be adjusting their May 1st deadline to May 15th. So May 1 is college signing day, as a lot of us would like to think of it. But a number of institutions had to, of course, move that deadline back, some moving it back as far as June 1st. Now, when we think about how this impacted students, so as Jim had shared earlier, the FAFSA application completion rates are down around 10.9% from at the exact same time of this time last year. And so with all of the issues that happened with the FAFSA, even though enrollment, we have seen an uptick in enrollment over the past, definitely over the last year, there was a 2.5% increase in enrollment, and within undergraduate students and even more within graduate students. And we've been gradually over the past 2 years seeing an increase in post-secondary education. Well, that's going to quickly change once we look at what the fall enrollment numbers, what they will be. Of course, we're basing this off of the number of FAFSA applications that are filed in large part, but there's also something called summer melt too as well. So even for students who complete a FAFSA, and they can say, hey, I will agree to attend this institution, they could very well just kind of drop off after that. But a number of students weren't able to really compare and contrast in a way that would allow them to make the best informed decisions for themselves when it came to student aid. Student aid is very important because obviously a student has to fund their post-secondary education. Not every student has the ability to use their family's wealth for that. So for a number of students who come from families of low wealth, then the Pell Grant becomes very important. And aid from other student aid programs, such as the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant Program or the Federal Work Study Program, becomes very, very important. And of course, students can always turn to student loans. And if they are low-income students, they can benefit from a subsidized student loan. But if they're not a low-income student, then obviously they have unsubsidized student loans that they can utilize. And there's Grad Plus loans and Parent Plus loans too, as well. So with all of this being said, students, since they weren't able to properly compare and contrast, you had some students just not even apply at all. Some students definitely felt a pressure to just go with the institution that could offer the aid first. A number of institutions are struggling with their enrollment numbers, and because You had some institutions who had more resources that could guarantee aid for the student because they knew they had the resources to fall back on. Well, that definitely placed those institutions that could not do the same at an unfair advantage. And so we at ACE heard some angst amongst our membership, the different types of institutions, based on size, based on resources of, hey, this is really impacting my ability to recruit students, to, properly enroll students, because we're unable to really give the proper information to the student based on what aid package that we can offer. One other thing I wanted to throw in here really quickly is that when it comes to the ICERs, a huge negative impact that this process has had on our institutions is still this gray cloud of when they are audited, what is that going to look like? And I say that because the department, in order to try to speed things along, because things were just, not going as planned, they had shared with our institutions that, hey, you can use ICERs with incorrect information and process that and share with the students what their aid package could be, as long as that information didn't result in less aid for the student. If the information resulted in less aid for the student, we're actually encouraging you in a lot of ways not to do that. But it's up to you. But the student deserves all the aid the student can get. So as long as the ICER allows for the student to receive the most aid, you have to go with that. If there's a lesser amount of aid, it's your choice, whether or not. So if the data is incorrect on the ICER, no big deal. And even though the department said we, as far as programmatic reviews are concerned and things of that nature, we're going to understand that we told you can move forward with an ICER with incorrect information. That's not always the same when it comes to actually being audited. And on our campuses are working professionals with the goal of providing the best experience for students. It is nonprofit work. And so these people who are handling the awarding of aid, they are taught to dot their I's and they're taught to cross their T's. So in a lot of ways goes very much so against everything that they have been trained to do, to say, oh, we're going to process a record with inaccurate information. So we're still waiting to see what the outcomes of that will be, but this gives you a high level overview of impact on institutions and the impact on students. And one thing I guess I'll also say is that CBO did project that there will be a fewer amount of students that would be able to take advantage of the Pell Grant. So the department had shared a little over 7 million students for academic year 2024-2025 and 2025-2026 would be able to take advantage of the Pell Grant. Well, CBO has estimated around 5.9 million students. And in speaking with them, they basically based this off of the number of FAFSA applications that were completed at that time, which were down 40%. But they decided to settle on a 10% decrease in applications relative to 2023. And in 2025, CBO is predicting to have applications rebound back to the 2023 levels. So Jim, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. And just to summarize it, it's had a pretty bad impact on students. It's had an impact on the institutions, potentially their enrollment, and something I hadn't really articulated before, the lack of the strain on the relationship between FSA and the institutions. Steve, Diane, anything you want to add to the impact on?
Yeah, so I think one other impact that gets maybe less attention is the impact on states. So as public institutions have been grappling with this, the FAFSA debacle, thinking about how they'll make award letters or awards to students to make that enrollment decision, those private elite institutions, as Emmanuel sort of indicated, they've got the endowments to help cover any gap between what a student's aid award from the federal government might be, and if there was a gap between that actual federal government aid award and what the institution has committed to a student, they can cover that gap. But many public institutions are saying, well, we can't cover that gap. So they're looking to states to say, state, you have funds that you use to subsidize higher education. In some cases, you've got state grants. How are you, state, going to help cover the gap so that we can give award letters to students so they can make enrollment decisions in the absence of these federal dollars and students knowing how much they'll get? And so it did put states in a tough spot to essentially say, we may be filling a gap that doesn't even need to be filled because the federal dollars may be there for these students at sometime in the fall, but we as states may need to put the money up, and states are not going to get that money back from institutions. And so it did create this interesting federal government dropped the ball on its funding role. States are now having to think about how they pick it up, and institutions are saying, who's going to give us the money? They're pointing at both, right?
Yeah.
They're saying, federal government, step up, give us the money for the benefit of the student. State, step up, help close the gap in the interim. So it's put states in a bind to have to potentially fund higher ed beyond what they had initially anticipated. And this
point, Steve.
Concern I've heard from many state lawmakers over the past 6 to 9 months.
Diane, anything to add to the picture of the disaster, or do you want to start moving in what might be done to fix it?
I'll talk a little bit about the disaster. First of all, it was predictable. The department, its data systems are old, and we can talk about this in a minute, but I want to take a step back. I think one of the things that I think this disaster brought a lot of attention to is the fact that the federal government is now the primary financier of higher education. And when the Higher Education Act was passed in 1965, that wasn't the intent, that wasn't the way it was supposed to be. So the original programs included the department making grants to states, and then they allocated those funds to their institutions, and for the Department of Education to guarantee federal student loans, but those loans were made by private lenders and managed by state guarantee agencies. And so what you see is an agency that was built to be a guarantee agency, now running one of the largest entitlement programs in the federal government. And I say it's an entitlement program because in 1992, Congress radically expanded the program so that it was not just grants and loans for low-income students, but that it was also loans for higher income students and their parents. And so this loan program is huge, and it is the rare institution that can survive without participating. So I think one of the things that we all saw with the meltdown this year is just how dependent students and families and institutions are on this program. And that should raise concerns. That should raise concerns for a number of different reasons. But the primary being that the department was not set up to do that job. And so what we saw is a failure of data systems, a failure of interagency reactions. And then I'll just add that, Congress poured a little bit of fuel on this fire as well, because it takes years to develop the FAFSA. So the FAFSA form, even in a regular year when nothing changes, the department starts years in advance to get the form developed, to push it through testing, to get it ready to go. It works with some schools that volunteer to use the new form. This was a fundamental upheaval because it was a new data system that the department had to create by connecting to the IRS data system. And we can talk about this in a little bit, but that was a challenge that we took on and while we were still at the department. And I'll never forget my first meeting with the IRS to talk about connecting these data systems. And they plopped onto the table, a manual that was, 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper and this thick. And they said, well, these are all the security protocols that you have to meet. And meanwhile, the department's data systems, many of them date back to the 70s. Many are still programmed in COBOL. And as the department likes to say, the whole thing's been duct taped together for too long anyway. So I understand the concern on students and institutions, but I also think the bigger question is, how do we get to this place where the federal government is the primary financier, of higher education, where institutions are so dependent? And by the way, I worked at Princeton and often said, if you don't like the regulatory regime, back away from it. They only had $13 billion in the bank then, but whatever. And and Princeton's response was, well, no, we're as dependent on Parent Plus loans as anybody else. So
Yeah.
so I think this really highlights the level of dependency. And I will say that the department worked aggressively to get Americans addicted to the program, because that's the hook that the department has to do all kinds of other things to manipulate the way higher education works. And the biggest problem is that while originally it was a good idea to have students complete a FAFSA because it meant that maybe they would get a grant that would make college affordable, although the grant has never paid for more than 100% of a community college, and it hasn't paid for more than 40% of community college since the 80s. So the grant doesn't really it helps, but it doesn't really get the student through. When a student is completing a FAFSA, they are completing a loan application. And governors that require students to complete the FAFSA to graduate should also be handing them a credit card application, because that's what they're doing. They're dangling dollars in front of students and parents. Most of those dollars are loan dollars. And most 18-year-olds don't really understand how lending works. So the other big concern I have is that we have just pushed everybody to complete this form, and then you dangle dollars in front of people. And so of course they want to take those dollars, but not everybody using them is ready for college or even wants to go to college. So, taking a step back from the immediate problem, I just think this raises much bigger questions about the system, the program. Can the department ever come up to speed and run a program this large, and should it? So
And before we get there, Diane, let me just, based on what you're saying, the department now has delayed again. They've said they're not going to implement by October 1st this year for next year. And I'll ask the other panelists this question too. They've moved the deadline to December 1st. Give me a probability. Do you think it's very likely, somewhat likely, not at all likely that they'll meet the December 1st deadline?
So from what I understand, not at all likely. And again, this is a different methodology than when I was at the department. And so I've never run this new methodology myself. But as I understand it, part of this formula that's used by the department to generate the ICER includes something called an income protection allowance. So students and parents are allowed to have a certain amount of income that's protected from being taxed, so to speak, toward financial aid. So a certain amount of your income is sort of pushed aside and ignored in the formula. And as I understand it, those income protection allowance tables have to be updated annually, but cannot be updated until there's an appropriations bill.
Yeah.
So that's how I understand it. And if that is the case, I mean, I can't even remember the last time Congress passed appropriations bills on time. So if in fact,
I'm that old. So I do remember when they did it.
If Congress is going to, have a continuing resolution until February, and they don't do anything about allowing these income protection allowance tables to be published, there's no way the department can be ready on time, because Congress has made it impossible. So there are certain elements of it that are outside of the department's control.
So I hear you. And Steve, let me ask you first. Do you sense it's likely they'll be up and running in December 1st, even putting aside the allocation table or the income protection tables?
Yeah, I think there will be every effort to try and meet that commitment by December 1st by the department. I mean, let's be honest, it's an election year. If they dare say, we don't have certainty that it's going to be this year, we think everybody should plan for delayed awards next spring, it's an election year.
Yeah.
Families are going to be thinking about that top of mind this fall when they're going to vote, that their government has yet again failed them at the time that they are trying to make serious decisions about where their kids are going to college. And whether
nice of you to point out December 1st is probably not an accident in terms of when they said it. Emmanuel, what's your own thoughts about this?
Unfortunately, I think that the department is actually kicking the can down the road. The writing is on the wall that if we're already delaying to December 1st, there's going to be some other reason why it needs to be December 15th, and then some unforeseen reason why it needs to be later. It makes it makes me very nervous. And I know at ACE, when it comes to proposals, we actually sent a letter with a number of proposals to fix the FAFSA issues, and one of those being move up the deadline from January 1st to October 1st. So we can just make sure everything is signed, sealed, and delivered by then, ideally. But that's not the situation that we're in now.
Right. What other ideas, other than just sort of legislating, they have to do it by October 1st? What other ideas did ACE have for fixing FAFSA for next year?
Yeah, so we actually put together a working group and worked over 3 months to come together with some things that we could all agree to as a community to send to Congress. And one of the first things that we articulate is establishing a hold harmless protection for institutions of higher education that process the original ICERs. So if you recall earlier, I had mentioned that there were ICERs with inaccurate information, but institutions were told, oh, you can go ahead and process those as long as it does not result in less aid for students. And so that was number one, hold harmless provision. Number two was move up the FAFSA deadline from January 1 to October 1. Another idea we had was to require a comprehensive assessment of the family farm and small business exclusion. There have been some legislation introduced, obviously, to fix that. It was a change in the need analysis formula to now include the assets of a family farm or small business when they were originally excluded. We did ask that there would be an allowance for an alternative SAI to ensure maximum aid eligibility. That's something that used to take place, and the new student aid index removed this alternate EFC, which is what it was before, but now SAI. The next thing that we had was to add the housing question back to the FAFSA form. We had heard initially that there was some further complications of having students need to complete additional forms in order for institutions to receive that information to proper aid appropriately. And then the last three that we had, I'll go through really quick, was to allow for married students who are separated to be considered independent, and to allow for increased usage of the FAFSA data due to language changes to the tax code in the Future Act, and then additional changes around how institutions can use the data for research purposes in the FAFSA Simplification Act of 2020. And the very last thing was to reduce the income verification now that IRS transfers data directly to Ed. So
right. Okay, so I can see where most of that is and why ACE would want most of that. Diane, Steve, do you have any reactions to those proposals?
You know, I from my perspective, I think, you know, anytime I don't disagree with Emmanuel. I think there were some methodological changes that were bad, and I think the changes that he suggests are necessary. But I can tell you that adding those changes is just going to further set the department back, because that requires a contract modification with the contractor and new ways to manipulate the data. So I agree with him long term. I almost think from a practical perspective that, you know, Congress needs to do, or at least to allow the department to do a few things. You know, one is to say, go ahead and use this year's income protection allowance next year. And Congress could fairly easily authorize that. So you don't have to wait for the next appropriation. Let's go with the tables that you've already used. Congress could say, you know what, a student who already has an ICER, whose income has not significantly declined, meaning they'd be eligible for more aid, they can use it again next year. Let the schools use it again next year. The other thing is, the trickiest part about the methodology is not deciding who gets a grant or a loan. It's actually pretty easy to figure out who's going to get a grant. The place where you split hairs is deciding how much of an unsubsidized loan a student should get and how much of a subsidized loan a student should get. So that's really, when you dig into the details of the formula, that's what a lot of the calculations determine. I mean, this would be an expensive solution, but Congress could say, let's just give all the loans as subsidized loans next year, and that would reduce the, you know, the challenge. So it's an expensive one.
Yeah.
So I think, but I think modifying the methodology at this point, it takes the department a year to develop the form and another year to test it. So that could put us another 2 years back. So I almost think that Congress needs to step in, take a step back, figure out how to make the process easy for this year, while some of these changes Emmanuel was talking about can take place on the back end.
Yeah. So look, this is a great segue to our last segment of the webinar today. What does all this mean for the future of higher education policy generally? And I think we've had a pretty good discussion about, like, it's really a problem right now. It's really hard to fix. Steve, do you mind starting off our discussion about what all of this could mean to the future of policy?
Sure. Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I mean, we're at a sort of an inflection point for higher education. Just in the past few years, really since COVID, families, students, they are rethinking what their sort of students, their children will do after high school. So where it was college or bust or college for all in the 90s, the early 2000s, really COVID had sort of shone a light on what people were getting for their money. Families and students are increasingly questioning the value and the relevance of higher education, of a college degree, and that's evident in a number of national surveys. And we've done polling at Stand Together. There are other public polls out there that show families are increasingly open to alternatives to degrees, whether it's short-term certificates, whether it's boot camps, training programs in healthcare and IT. And so we're at this moment where higher ed and the federal government via Title IV has a moment either to step up and sort of make it right, and for higher ed to pivot, or risk losing an entire population of students this current year, maybe next year, who thought they were going to college, who maybe over that summer, as Emmanuel mentioned, sort of the summer melt. That's even more serious this year as students don't have that award letter. Those students may look somewhere else and say, like I was planning on college, I don't have an award letter. Let me see what else is out there. So now, May, June, July, they find some alternate boot camp training program that's not even Title IV or federal student aid eligible, but they see that as a viable pathway, and then higher ed loses out on that student, at least in the near term. And I actually don't think that's a bad thing. I think that the FAFSA debacle is actually an opportunity for these non-college alternatives to show up, demonstrate the value, the relevance of these low-cost pathways that actually propel people into meaningful careers. And there are a number of them. Not saying that there are hundreds and hundreds of them, but there are several exemplars that of these providers out there that are actually helping students in a short form, 12, 16 weeks, get the skills, get a credential, connect with an employer, get a job, and within a year or two, they're earning six figures in healthcare and IT. And it's amazing to see that these outcomes actually far surpass the outcomes that they might realize had they gone to a college, attained debt, got a degree, delayed their earnings potential 4, 5, 6 years. So I think it's actually unearthing a lot of opportunities for families and parents and students to be looking at as an alternative to a college degree, because quite frankly, for far too long, it has been college as the preferred, premier, privileged pathway. And the way our systems are set up with Title IV, federal student aid, we essentially stack the deck and tell students you should go to college. It is your best option. And if you want to pursue something else, good luck. There isn't support for you to do that because you can only use your federal student aid at an accredited university. And I think that's in part why we've seen over the decades, millions of Americans go to college, they start a degree, they stop out. There are 40-ish million Americans in this status now that stopped out. They have some credits, they have debt and no degree. We as a society have pushed them into a pathway that may not have been right for them out the gate. And look, It's not lost on me. I'm sitting here with a whole higher ed background and 3 degrees behind me. It doesn't mean that it's the best pathway for everyone. It should be an option, and it should be an option throughout one's lifelong sort of learning journey. But we should not be stacking the deck and saying to 18-year-olds, you must complete a FAFSA, you must think about college as your only route, and that's where you go. That's the direction that you have available to you. We've got to be thinking about the signal that all of this sends. And just one more thing, like,
okay, and then I'm going to, you've given us a lot of grist for discussion, but go ahead.
one more thing. So Diane mentioned this idea, though, of requiring all these 18-year-olds to fill out a FAFSA, effectively complete this loan application. Think about it. 15 states require students to complete a FAFSA to graduate from high school. Now, there are some opt-out processes, and you're asking an 18-year-old to navigate some complex opt-out processes to do that. But effectively, we're compelling students and families to complete an application for a loan or a grant and saying to them, we are making it a requirement for you to graduate. So there's probably, and given the audience of lawyers at FedSoc here, there are probably some compelled speech issues or First Amendment issues with that. Folks smarter than myself can go look into that, but I just think it sends the wrong signal. And I just think this is a time where there is now openness, and this creates a window for us to talk about alternatives to college.
Yeah. And the only thing I'd add before allowing Diane and Emmanuel to pipe in, it's not only that so many students don't complete their degrees, we're actually, as we're analyzing the data, a large number, particularly of low-income students, are getting degrees that are not a positive return on investment. So there is something else fundamentally going wrong with the system. Diane, please, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, that's okay. So I think, I agree with Steve. There are other pathways. I'm a huge fan of apprenticeship. I spent many years working, trying to build the apprenticeship opportunities. I think these are a much better option for many people because it means they don't have to give up their income while they're learning and gaining skill, and it gets them into the social networks of employment, and I think those are really helpful things. So it is a good time to look at alternatives. And, we hear from employers, we love the idea of apprenticeship, but there's no funding for that. So if there were a way to provide at least, some sort of support to help employers get these, programs up and running. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is when a student fills out the FAFSA, their parent also has to complete it. And, some kids have challenges getting their parents to complete it. And oftentimes low-income parents are, very reticent to complete it because they don't want their children to see how low their income is. And at the other end, some of the higher income parents don't want their children to see how much they make because they feel like their children can't put it into perspective. So this is another, conundrum, I guess, of the situation, is that it's not just the student, it's the student, it's the parent, and under the new methodology, it's not necessarily even the custodial parent anymore. So there's a lot to completing one of these forms, and parents can be reluctant. So I just think there are lots and lots of questions, but I do agree that the time is right to start looking for alternatives. Even if people will eventually go to college, apprenticeship doesn't mean you never go to college. It just might mean that you delay it until you can actually have an employer pay some of the tuition, or you'll have a chance to earn money first. So, and then, from a practical point of view, the biggest challenge with getting the new FAFSA released is that it required the Department of Education to link its data systems to the IRS. And the department's data systems are just too old and just too out of date. So one of the big questions is, should the department even be running something so sophisticated, or should they be on the policy side, but Treasury actually run the formulas? Because, by the way, they already have the income data. They wouldn't have to connect the pipe. So I think there are big policy questions also about whether this should continue to reside with the Department of Education, or maybe because it's a huge entitlement program, maybe it's time to move it to Treasury.
Yeah. So, Emmanuel, I'm going to call on you next. And there are 2 points that have been floated here. One is we move FAFSA completely out of the Department of Ed and have Treasury do it. And the other is that we put apprenticeships and other alternative pathways on a level playing field with 4-year schools or colleges and universities. You represent the colleges and universities. So why don't you start there, talk about the other point of view here? Or maybe that's not, I don't even know what ACE's position is on it.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. I will answer this question, not on the behalf of ACE, but just in conjunction with my role at ACE and in talking directly with these presidents of these institutions, talking directly with other faculty and staff on campuses, and talking with students too as well. The first point is around the FAFSA. I do understand the points that my colleagues, who I greatly respect, were making for sure. But I think just to have a little bit of a rebuttal to that on the other side of the coin, obviously, when a student is completing the FAFSA, they give themselves the opportunity to have a better understanding of how they can finance their post-secondary education. And so one thing I do love about living in the United States is that we can choose. We can make the choice to pursue what it is we like to pursue. Now, once we make that choice, there are barriers, unfortunately, for some types of individuals in obtaining the goals of the choices that they've made. But at least it starts with the fact that I can choose a direction. And for students who may be considering college, they may not necessarily know exactly what will work best for them. Completing the FAFSA gives them the opportunity to weigh their choices and say, oh, well, I know that I would have access to X amount of aid. If I were to go, I don't have to take on the loans if I don't want to take on the loans. But even though a lot of students are in places where they have to, because the grant aid that's available doesn't cover enough and they have to use something. They don't have the family wealth to fall back on in order to afford their post-secondary education. But on top of that, even though ACE, obviously we represent the colleges and universities, of course there are alternative paths. We can't act like there are not. And because we live in a country where we can choose what's best for us, then there is definitely the belief that a person should choose the path that is best for them. But what we believe it's our duty to do is ensure that the decisions that are made are informed. And so when we think about decisions being informed, then, the data still shows us that for those students that choose to go to college, when it comes to the labor market and earnings, their earnings do increase the higher the credential, and the employment rate decreases the higher their credential. There are social and economic upward mobility that's attached to attending a college or university and getting that experience. Jim, you talk about the return on investment for certain programs. Of course, if we're looking at this in a formulaic way where we say A plus B will then equal C, then if you attend a liberal arts program that doesn't have an exact occupation tied to it, then there is an argument on return of investment. But it all depends on how you define return on investment. Because if you do talk to faculty on campus, they will tell you something very differently as it relates to return on investment. But so either way, we are living in a world where there are
Well,
many
Emmanuel, let me probe that, because I want to understand how they look at return on investment. From a federal policy making, the reason Congress had a consensus to get involved in federal student aid is that it increased our economic productivity.
Mhm.
And so that consensus may be falling apart, but that was the basis of it. How do people on college campuses talk about it?
So, not that I can speak for everyone on college
Right.
campus, but I am currently a student at Penn.
That's right.
And I'm getting my doctorate degree right now. And I have the ability to be able to ask my professors their thoughts on some of these things. And just as I'm talking with different members that we have, it's just good for me to hear what their thoughts are, right? Because they are the experts and I am the conduit of their
Right.
expertise. And so when it comes to return on investment, they don't necessarily agree with a formula of this program needs to produce this level of this earnings amount. And if this earnings amount is not achievable for these students, that means that the program that the knowledge they gained is then moot. You know,
Oh, I see.
and so because I feel like because of policy, and we're thinking more the lines of how can we understand this better? How can we make this make sense? Students go to college to get a job, right? That's becoming the narrative. Students go to college to get a job. That's why they're going to college, to get a job. And not that faculty would disagree necessarily, but it's the learning process, it's the transferable skills, it's the ability of a student to do more than a trained skill for when their mind changes in their career 10 years down the line, they can be able to adjust and have flexibility with the career shift, but still have the education they received be valuable to them as they're looking for that job in that new career shift 10 years.
And now I do understand. I mean, there's some value to truth, goodness, and beauty being understood by a large segment of the population. There then becomes a question of whether taxpayers should pay for that, but that is a separate issue.
So
Diane, Steve, go ahead.
Can I jump in here? So I agree with Emmanuel. So I'm not one of those people that thinks, liberal arts is a waste and everybody should go to college, for job training. I think that there's a big difference between somebody who wants to go to college and study the liberal arts, and they're well prepared and they have the academic skills. And I think they can get a great liberal arts degree and take that into the workplace, and there will be jobs for them if they can read well and speak well. So I would never want to interfere with somebody who's pursuing liberal arts because that's their passion. I think, though, what we've seen is 70% of community college graduates who earn a degree earn it in general studies. And, the return on that investment is not what we'd like to see. So the question is, how many of those students actually wanted to pursue a general studies degree and now they're going to transfer, versus how many colleges are pushing students into general studies and liberal arts that's not rigorous, just so they can get them to the finish line. And then that reduces what appears to be the return on investment. And it's not because there's something wrong with liberal arts education. It's that it's become, the place where colleges put students that really aren't academically ready. And if you're not academically ready, then your chances of getting a job with a liberal arts degree are significantly diminished. So I think if we look at the people who are interested in liberal arts or theater or any of the fields that are not high paying, the people who are truly capable and passionate, they will turn it into a job, a career, something down the line. But the water just gets muddied because so many colleges are so focused on keeping them enrolled and getting them to the finish line that there has been an expansion of very low quality general studies, things that are called liberal arts that I would not think most of us would recognize them as liberal arts. And so I think you get the water muddied. So I think, for people who really want to pursue it, we should never stand in their way, but it should not be the catch-all for people who don't really want to go to college, don't know why they want to go to college, but the colleges want to keep them enrolled. So I think there's some tension there. And I think that some of the numbers we see on ROI, they're not clean numbers because it's not just capturing people who are passionate about medieval studies or French literature and are academically prepared to graduate from a very rigorous program in those fields.
Got it. Steve, you must have more thoughts on this. You're on mute though, so.
Yeah, I would just say one thing quickly. So when I was at ACE, I was there for 7 years. I actually wrote about this very thing. And there is certainly value in the liberal arts curriculum and contributing to a vibrant democratic society. Liberal arts done well will prepare students to become adaptable workers and learners. It will help them develop things like job crafting behavior. And in fact, I released a paper at ACE in February 2020 talking about how we create adaptable learners for an uncertain environment. And that is liberal arts done well. And I think when liberal arts curriculum are not done well, and you see students graduate and they start to flounder in the job market and they're underemployed persistently, that's a low performing program. If you're a phenomenal liberal arts program, you're preparing that individual to adapt and overcome and change to different circumstances in a labor market that's dynamic. That's a very different ROI for that student.
Thank you. And since I have a liberal arts degree, I appreciate your saying that. Emmanuel, do you want to sort of respond to this back and forth? I thought your point was it's good for people to have that choice, and then the pursuit of it is a separate issue.
Well, really, my response is I respect the opinions of my colleagues. What they're saying is not wrong. You know, we're not saying anything wrong here. We're just giving you a full, holistic, comprehensive view and look and take at the pursuit of a post-secondary education and what that looks like. But I go back to my original point. We are in a country where we can choose. We can make a choice. But, you know, Diane is right. When a person is 18 years old, 19 years old, outside influences can definitely have a bigger say in what that student chooses. But back to my point, as long as we make sure that the student can make an informed decision, that is our job. So.
Great. And I think that might be a great way to end the webinar today. Marie, I don't think we had any questions, but people should feel free to reach out to us. If you can't figure out how to do that, do it through the Federalist Society. Any concluding comments, folks? Marie, why don't you wrap us up?
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you to these fantastic panelists for sharing your points of view, and thank you to the audience for tuning into this program. For more content like this on the regulatory state and the American way of life, please visit us at regproject.org. That is regproject.org.